What do Japanese bowls in Chelmsford, Jamaican gun crime, and schools in Peckham all have in common? Well, today's guest might just be the answer to that. Welcome to the final episode in this series of the Make You Known podcast. For our grand finale today, we are honoured to have as our guest an Essex lad with an OBE who's devoted the former part of his life to fighting knife crime and turning around the lives of youths on the streets of suburban London, and now is tackling the rising tide of mental health issues on a global level. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Patrick Regan of Kintsugi Hope. You can find him at www.kintsugihope.com. That's all one word, KINTSUGIHOPE.com. They're on Instagram, also at Kintsugi Hope. And Patrick is on Instagram at Patrick Regan 2726, I believe.
That's
because
true, yeah.
There was 2,275 Patricks before. He's also the author of several books, and the one I've been reading is Honesty Over Silence, and I would definitely recommend you check that out. Today we're going to be talking about mental health, and Patrick, we're thrilled that you're here with us. So before we talk about mental health generally and stuff like that, I'd just like to get a bit of a picture of you and your journey. So could you just share with us your testimony, like why you were Christian and how has that survived your mental health struggles?
Yeah, I guess I've got one of those testimonies which is very similar to a lot of people that are brought up in a Christian family, where I became a Christian at a very young age. But I think with lots of people that have been through that experience, there's a time where your faith becomes more your faith than your parents' faith. I think that was probably when I was 16, and I went to Waterloo and to do a sort of mission there, and spent a lot of time working with the homeless and working in a place called Cardboard City. And I remember sitting there, and there's one guy, we're in a circle with homeless guys. One guy had begged enough to get a hamburger, and he took the hamburger and passed it around the circle, and everyone took a bite out of it each, and he handed it to me. And I thought, oh my goodness, I have everything, you have nothing, and yet you're sharing out of your poverty. And written in the walls of Cardboard City were the words, "Welcome to reality." And I think at that point, like, my sort of Christian bubble burst. And that whole thing in James 2:17, faith without action is dead. And realised that actually God just became much more real at that moment, and living my faith out, and what does that look like as well. So it's a journey, that I guess there's been lots of journeys, ups and downs in that.
Yeah, and through your struggles you've been through, your faith has that kind of underpinned, has that helped you through, or how have you fought with it? Or
Yeah, I mean, definitely thought of it. I think that you talk about struggles. I feel like everyone goes through what's all I describe as the Tetris moment. Do you remember the game Tetris?
Yeah.
All these blocks fall out of the sky, and you're trying to get them in a straight line, and then once you got them in a straight line, it's a computer game, and then the line disappears, and more blocks start coming, and they get faster and faster and faster, and then eventually you think, oh my goodness, it's like game over. And I think for me, I went through a period where everything went wrong. I physically got very, very ill. My kids got really, really ill. My dad got cancer. We lost a baby, miscarriage. I started struggling with anxiety, and it just start caving in, and it's really, really hard. And I think that it often feels like a perfect storm of things going wrong at the same time. Why they all have to go wrong at the same time, I have no idea. And I think at that point I was like, God, why is this happening? And I think some of the theology that I was brought up with wasn't particularly helpful. I was prayed for so many times. When I didn't get healed, I ended up just feeling guilty. I ended up feeling sorry for the people praying for me because they were so passionate. And then I was told I had some unhidden sin in my life that I needed to repent of, and I repented of every sin that I could possibly think of. I even made some up just to make sure, and it was just like, God, what is going on? And I realized that, sometimes prayer isn't a magic wand. I think that sometimes we've almost treated it like zap, you're okay,
Yeah.
and faith is actually a massive journey, and just that sense of God with us, I think. Sometimes is what people need when they're going through a tough time. There isn't, stuff happens whether you're Christian, whether you're not a Christian. I wrote a book called When Faith Gets Shaken, and I was inundated with responses from people of faith and no faith going, "Oh, it's just nice to have something that's honest and real," and
Yeah.
and I think that's really important in our journey. So yeah, it's less black and white now, and probably a bit grayer, I have to say, but that's okay. I'm quite comfortable with that.
Yes, I think that's the reality, isn't it,
Mm,
for many people? And
yeah.
so you've had depression and anxiety, is that correct?
Yeah, I
As
mean, I think more, definitely have had both, but more struggle ongoing with anxiety. And I think that, I think a lot of people, it's hard, isn't it? Because there are moments where I think I've learned to manage it a lot better now.
yeah,
And so I'm doing good. But yeah, it is a tough thing.
yeah. So could you talk us through, like, do you have any daily habits or techniques or things that you for dealing with these conditions? So say you wake up on a random Tuesday morning, and I don't know how it is for you, because I mean that's, I suppose, one of the things we might talk about in a bit about mental health. Is it seems to be like it can be quite different from person to person.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Yeah.
do you, like, if you wake up and you're just like, oh, I know it's one of those days, the clouds hanging over me or the knot in my stomach is there.
Yeah.
What's your go-to? What do you do?
I think for me, exercise is really important. So I wear a Fitbit, and one of my things is I try and do 5,000 steps before lunch, and don't always succeed. But there is a real sense of being able to actually like, and sometimes it's comes easy, and sometimes it's a real decision of of your will. And so like this morning, like I got into work, and actually instead of going into the office, I actually walked for 20 minutes. So I think sometimes just allowing yourself that space, exercise is really important. I think it's not so much what it's not always what you do, it's what you don't do. So if you're like someone that struggles with health anxiety, the worst thing is going to Dr. Google for a diagnosis, because then that just sets your brain going. Because suddenly you come up with some very rare disease. I'm saying to my wife, I've got a headache, but in my head it's a brain tumor. And she's like, just take some paracetamol, you'll be okay, and don't go to Dr. Google anymore. So sometimes it's necessarily the things you don't do, and I think the other thing is just a habit of realizing about being kind to yourself. That actually, I think sometimes when you wake up, you feel anxious. Particularly as a Christian, you're like, then you feel guilty because like you should be trusting God. So actually, it's just cutting yourself some slack and going, you know what, I'm not going to go there in that sort of self beat myself up mode, which then just one thing leads to another, and you get yourself into a really dark place. So it is about what you do, but it's also what you choose not to do. I think is important.
Yeah, that's helpful, because you mentioned there about feeling guilty, and I think that's a big thing. And I sometimes
Yeah.
think for Christians who suffer with mental health problems, they've obviously got an advantage in knowing the sort of where they fit in the grand narrative of things and the hope of eternity and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, so in that respect, it's better for them. But for some respects, it's worse, because you almost feel like there's this obligation to be a happy, bright kind of person who almost has it together, which is not right. Correct?
Yeah, I think it's and that's interesting, is whether that comes from Christian culture or church culture or comes from the Bible. And which I suggest it's probably the first. And I think it is challenging because guilt is like, there's two types of guilt. There's true guilt and false guilt. True guilt is actually quite helpful. It means that, I say to my workers, if you're late every day for work, I'd quite like you to feel guilty. Just get up on earlier and get there on time. So true guilt can push you to be better. False guilt is actually often feeling guilty over things that you have no control over. And so I often talk about the shoulds, the must, I oughts. I should be okay. I ought to be better. I must pull myself together. And that narrative we can say over ourselves a lot of the time. And I think that's the challenge. And the shoulds, the must, the oughts, is actually how often do we go through that every single day. And guilt is really a hard thing to deal with. It is a very it's very, very, very difficult.
Yeah. Could you just tell us before we dive in a bit more into all that stuff, a little bit about Kintsugi Hope?
Yeah.
I was looking at your stuff, and it seems like you have fingers in a lot of pies. There's a lot going on, right?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I think in some ways, kintsugi obviously is a Japanese word that means golden joinery. So the whole idea is if you get a bowl and we break it, and you know, in the UK we'd probably mend it with super glue and we'd pretend it's all fantastic and it looks okay. What they do in Japan is they put a gold powder in the glue, so instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature of the cracks. So arguably, the object becomes more beautiful than it was before. It certainly becomes more unique. And I think that's an incredible metaphor for our lives in the sense that beauty comes out of brokenness, that our scars are not there to be ashamed of. You will not find one kintsugi bowl that looks like another kintsugi bowl. Completely unique. And so Kintsugi Hope was really built with that sort of thing. And we realized that there were a lot of people out there creating awareness around mental health issues, which is brilliant. But a lot of people going, all right, I get it. Now what? And then we'll go to the doctors and go on a 2-year waiting list. And you know, services are just being stretched. And so we wanted to create something where people could get support. And so we created the Kintsugi Wellbeing Groups, which is a little bit like I sort of describe it as Weight Watchers for wellbeing. You know, it's like get some friends, get some tools, and deal with all these issues that we all face in our lives. And so it's been incredible. It's a 12-week program, happens at the moment on Zoom, but also in person. And it's happening in pubs and coffee shops and schools and prisons. It's happening in people's homes. And we train people up to run it basically. So there's hundreds of these things now happening all over the UK, which is really exciting. So yeah, so that's our key focus in Kintsugi Hope, is just training churches up to run those as a way of inputting. You know, it's like someone said to me once, I thought it was a really good point, is if you have cancer, you will go to the hospital and they will give you chemo and radiotherapy and all the medical intervention you need. But to get through a cancer journey, you need love, support, commitment, fellowship, you know, company. And it's the same in mental health. You know, we've got to let the professionals do what the professionals do. We shouldn't try and do what they do. That's dangerous. But to get through a cancer journey, you need those things. And it's with mental health as well. You need those things. You need friendship, company, you know. We all have mental health the way we have physical health. We're all on a continuum. And so we want to invest in that the way you'd go to a gym to invest in your physical health. So yes, that's what Kintsugi is really all about.
Yeah, it's great, and I think it sounds like a great thing you're doing there. And talking about Kintsugi, I think it's a really interesting concept of that beauty coming out of the scars, almost as
Yeah.
you say, and which reminds me of a certain point in the book where you quote someone who says something along the lines of, "We need the darkness as much as the light."
Yeah.
And I think you go on to comment and say, like, maybe it's time we stopped rushing to
Yeah.
get through the dark patches. Could you say anything about that, about this? Maybe actually, because for me, when I read that, that was quite almost a revolutionary thought, that, hey, maybe it's not all about I'm in this dark place, get me out of here.
Yeah.
It's a case of let's do something. There's a reason I'm here.
Yeah,
Or,
absolutely. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because darkness traditionally is sort of seen as vampires, depression, gangs, like every connotation to do with darkness is often negative. And yeah, obviously we need the darkness. Creation needs the darkness. And I think what the darkness does sometimes when it comes into our lives, it challenges our values and it says actually what's really, really important here. Because you can't see ahead in the same way. You have to trust God in a completely different way. I think it challenges your values. And, you know, that was interesting. When I did that, I studied a little bit throughout the Bible. You know, it's like Abraham, God revealed to Abraham, you know, like your descendants will be more numerous than the stars. You could see stuff in the darkness you can't see in the light. You can see the stars in the darkness. You can't see them in the light. Jacob wrestled with God in the darkness. It was Jesus in the desert, you know, left the desert full of, but actually it says he left the desert full of the power of the Holy Spirit. So he didn't leave the desert feeling absolutely exhausted and shattered. Something happened in that 40 days, 40 nights in the desert. And so, yeah, I think it's a really important point that, you know, we need the darkness. And I think I say in the book that my favorite game as a kid was hide and seek, but in the dark. That sense of I could always hear my dad, like, you know, and I'd be like, and actually if you're in the dark long enough, your eyes start to adjust. You start to see things that you didn't see before, and actually that sense of excitement as well can be there.
Yeah, I think you say that in the book as well, don't you? And it resonates. Is that there's a kind of you have a deeper appreciation of things that you otherwise wouldn't have had
Yeah.
before. And maybe it's like Paul, who was in prison, and he said, "Oh, I've learned to be content." And maybe the bigger challenge isn't necessarily overcoming the difficulty, but learning to live in it. Or
Yeah,
is that?
and the interesting thing about Paul, isn't it, is that actually he says, "I've learned to be content in all things." So it was a process. He wasn't born content. And then you look at what he went through and you think, flipping heck. You know what I mean? It was like, I've been beaten this time, shipwrecked, been in prison. And it's really interesting. I've literally just been thinking about this last couple of days. You have Paul and Silas in prison, and at 12 o'clock at night, they've just been beaten. So they've got open wounds. Their legs are in stocks. They're being stretched probably. It's 12 o'clock at night. They're in agony, and they decide to sing songs to God. And you think that is an incredible scene. But then you go on, and Paul's in prison again in Ephesus. And I reckon he must have done the same routine. Do you know what I mean? He must have thought, oh, there was an earthquake last time. That worked pretty well. He must have thought, I'm going to
Yeah.
pray. I'm going to sing God. Nothing. He stays there for ages, and it's almost like whether you come God or not, I'm still going to give you praise. And actually, there's a massive difference between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, Paul's in a really dark place. And it's partly all the stuff he's been through, but actually it's because all the internal politics in the church in Corinth as well. So he's in this really pit of a place. But it's almost like in that pit, he gets a real vision of who Jesus is. And I think that was like the New Testament church, is like when they were like really down, really persecuted, it's almost like they got a bigger vision of who Jesus was as well. Because I guess you need him more, right? And so, yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And the Bible's full of that stuff, but we don't often preach about it.
It's so interesting, isn't it? How it's only just really coming out of the cracks now, and you look at that the ancient texts, and
Yeah.
actually you can see Paul. One of the epistles he sort of talks about. I can't remember who it was. It's like Onesimus or someone who he
Yeah.
says whose life was spared, and I can't quote it on the spot, but he talks about he was grateful that he was grieved, one or spared one more grievance, which would have been just too much for me to bear.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's in
absolutely, yeah.
Philippians.
And he's really, really, Paul's very, very human side as well, and I think is beautiful. And obviously, you got that beautiful bit in Corinthians where it talks about that we are jars of clay being broken. And the interesting thing about jars of clay in that culture was they were made with the finest clay. In other words, they were made to be fragile, which I think is fascinating. They were made to break, so if you put a lamp inside of them, the lamp would get, the light would get out, and creating something quite beautiful. And I was saying to my team, that just fascinates me that we was almost designed to be fragile. We were designed to share our weaknesses. We were designed, so maybe that makes us human. And people connect much more with your scars than your success stories. And yet our preaching is sometimes success story after success story after success story. And then you're sitting there you're thinking, I'm feeling a bit rubbish about myself now because I can't relate to any of that. And it's not like, that stuff is bad. It's quite nice to hear sometimes, but I think it's just that sense of balance. And actually, when you read the Bible, 40% of the Psalms are laments. So that's 40% is like David just crying out to God. I just don't get it. I'm upset. I'm losing. My enemies are winning. I'm lonely. I don't get it. And if you translate that into 40% of our worship songs or 40% of our sermons, it wouldn't be that, would it?
Yes.
So I just think how fascinating the Psalms have been sung and read at some of the darkest times in history. There are stories of people at late at night in the Holocaust in Auschwitz reading the Psalms and going, I'm going to trust you, God. The darkest probably place in our history. It's incredible, really. I think that what God does, yeah.
So we've all got these, what you're saying about that going back, it's really interesting, and right up to the present day, we've all got these problems. And if I could summarize your kind of message in some ways, well, I guess it's the subtitle of your book is It's Okay Not to Be Okay, and to be honest and transparent about these things. And that's how we help one another, because if we walk around looking like we've got it all together, we're just kind of keeping up. Everyone knows it's a facade, and, it's just not reality. But what do we... how do we go about kind of sharing these things? Because you speak in your book about, Paul talks about boasting in his weakness. But how do you feel about talking about your problems to others? Say, do you, I feel for myself sometimes, if I feel absolutely rubbish, do I share this with an unbeliever? Is that a bad testimony, or is it okay, or is it we should just have a small group of people we share with and not everyone, or how do we go about sharing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there is a sense of wisdom, context, and I would say to people, find safe people, people you feel safe with, because I think what safe people do is they don't judge you. Because actually, if you're going through a tough time, you don't often want to be rescued. You don't want loads of advice. In fact, advice can sometimes just stress you out even more. It's like, who are those people that will just listen and be there for you, offer to pray for you if you want it. It's safe people, and I think everyone needs some safe people in their lives. And I think that's really, really important. And safe people often, naturally draw you closer to Jesus anyway. Yeah, and you know those people often who they are, and so I think everyone needs some safe people who they can chat to. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just almost thinking as you talk, is it like we should have people who are close to us that we can really pour out
Yeah.
into, but then maybe but we can still be speaking to other people and say, well, guess what, I have struggled with, or I am struggling with, without sort of on the same level, but being honest enough that they know that we've been through that. Because I was just talking earlier, and we were saying that if I don't share I've had this problem, then someone in my connections, my work circle or whatever, may go through the problem, say it's
Yeah.
depression, and they may think, well, who can I talk to about this?
Yeah,
And they don't know
absolutely.
anyone. Whereas if they know
Yeah. Yeah.
you've had something,
Yeah.
they'll think, oh, Jason's had it or Patrick's had it, we can talk
Yeah,
to them.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, I have a folder in my office from the emails I've got back from Honesty Over Silence, the book. And I mean, it's heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time, in terms of what people have been through and the sort of shame. And I think that's the key thing. Is shame is often that driver to why you keep things quiet. I always say, Brené Brown does some brilliant work on this. She talks about shame being that sense of I'm wrong, that sense of worthlessness. So guilt is I've done something wrong, shame is I am wrong. And she will say shame loves silence, secrecy, and judgment. That it has two voices. Who do you think you are? And you're not enough. And it's almost like those voices could act on a loop in your head, particularly if you just keep stuff to yourself the whole time. And so it's finding safe people, and it's there's context. There's obviously times where it's appropriate and not appropriate, but I think we should be a bit more courageous. It's often when someone shares their heart and goes, I'm really struggling with this. You don't go, oh, that's what a weak person, useless. I'm not talking to them. You go, oh, wow, I can really relate to that. Really appreciate you sharing that because it makes me feel less alone.
Yeah.
And I think that's good. I think we need, it's interesting. There's a survey come out recently talking about authentic relationships, friendships, and people going, you know what? I haven't actually got many people I can just be really real with, and that's because we keep up this facade, and we keep it at a surface level. Men have some of the highest suicide rates, and you ask an average guy how many really close friends have you got. They're struggling, well, a couple maybe. Would you tell them this? No. Like, it's like, and so the thought about the well-being groups is the reason we made it 12 weeks is like, the rules are it's non-judgmental, it's a safe and supportive space. It's like we can discuss these things. There was a really interesting week actually that we were doing a week on I think it was healthy relationships or something. And Di, my wife, was leading it, and she asked us to all write down our biggest fear and put it in an envelope. It's anonymous. Put it in the table, and then you take someone else's envelope and read out the biggest fear. So we were all like, "Oh my goodness, I'm sure I want to do this." And so I put mine down. But I wrote health anxiety, and then someone picked it up and went health anxiety. Next envelope, health anxiety. Third envelope. So like 4 of us out of 10 had written health anxiety. None of us had ever told each other that in the group. And then we were all going, oh yeah, do you do that thing when you Google when you got a headache and you suddenly got brain tumor? And they're like, yeah. And then actually there's some really dark humor that came into it then. But it was like almost like it was like this relief. Oh my goodness, we're just like each other. And there was an energy that came from that, And so I do think we've got to create a culture. If you define culture as the way we do things around here, we've got to have a much more real and authentic culture.
Yeah, I think that's gold, because particularly in today's age where often maybe younger people look at success as the amount of Instagram followers you've got or the amount of Facebook friends you have. And it's like, actually, you need two people with whom you can properly...
Yeah, and I think success, is interesting, isn't it? What we've made it. I've been thinking a lot about this recently as well. I think success with results with productivity. It's like how many views you got, how many people watch your podcast, how many is this, how many is that. Success, and you said this off air, really. Actually, success is living by your values. And if your values are to make a difference, if your values are generosity, if your values are restoration, healing, kindness, then actually, I often say to people, if your value is community and you work every hour God sends you, then but you've got loads of money, you're not living by your values because you've got no community in your life, you've got no relationship. And so I think a really good question is, what is my values as a person? What are the kingdom values? What does Christ call me to be? Am I living by those values? Because your values will inform your behavior. Your values are like prioritization. This is what's the most important thing to me. So for me, it's not just what you do; it's how you do it. And I think that's so important in this sort of success-driven, results-driven culture that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and maybe actually success is more involved than as you're saying that, it's making me think that maybe success is more involved in all this than we realize, because as you say, and I know what it is to constantly feel like I'm not doing well enough and I'm not like achieving high enough enough. And there's almost this constant like nagging in the back of your mind going, go on, go on, go on, push harder, because you're not a somebody yet. And actually that's not healthy.
No, and it goes back to what Paul was saying, wasn't it? Being content in all things. So you are enough. And we need you to be more you. We need you to be more Jason, because you've got unique gifts that I just don't have. And we just want those to be expressed in all the creativity and all the stuff that you can bring. Is so important. We don't want you to be like anyone else, and to live in a culture that constantly says you're not enough, or who do you think you are, is massive. So we've got to respond with listening to an alternative voice, and I think that's part of the challenge with mental health. If I'm honest, I sort of feel like we've taken verses like take captive every thought in Corinthians, and the way I used to see it, I used to hear this preached in that every time a negative thought comes in your head, you just bash it in the name of Jesus. You quote scripture at it, and I don't know about you, Jason, but like every time I try not to think about something, the more I think about it. I'm just like, there's the worst thing, isn't it, when someone says to you, if you can't sleep, well, just stop fit, and you just think, I can't sleep, sleep, and then just like you definitely can't sleep now because that's all you're thinking about. And my mate said it's a little bit like this. He said, if you can imagine the thoughts as trains coming into a railway station, you can stand in that railway station or the London Underground and you can shout at the train, you're not coming in the name of Jesus. The fact is the train's going to arrive every 2 minutes. And he was like, maybe taking captive every thought is more around choosing whether I'm going to get on the train or not. It's like a bit like I was saying at the start, it's sometimes choosing what not to do and not just what to do. Maybe I'm not going to let that thought take me into that really dark, negative place today. I'm going to try my best to stay off of it. And the way you do that is actually going, is that what God says over me? Is that what my best mate would say over me? And then you start saying, bringing some of that to mind. And you go, no, actually, this is, we make our weakness our identity. And actually saying, no, this is part of me. It's not the whole of me. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Reminds me of the old saying, you can't stop the birds flying over your head, but you can stop making a nest.
Yeah, exactly,
which is helpful. You mentioned just a bit before about male suicide figures, and it is the biggest killer of men under 40, right?
Yeah.
Is that because we don't open up enough, or what can be done about this? Can we change this?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yeah, I think it is. I think we don't talk about this stuff enough, and I think that we do need to change culture. And I think it's a huge issue because I think it's the sort of culture that males present often, and media present, and all sorts of things. I think sometimes where guys have opened up and it's gone wrong, then that makes them withdraw completely as well. So it is a really sensitive issue. But again, I go back to how do we create safe and supportive space? Because if you feel safe and you feel supported, the likelihood is you're going to go for it. If you're not going to feel judged, if you're not going to be told you don't have enough faith, all those things that we can sometimes with the best intentions in the world, trying to help people, we say, we've got to work through all that. And I sort of feel like if not now, then when? With the issues around mental health, the coronavirus, the pandemic that we're going through, it's like now is the time, surely, to have a culture change in this area.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what is the best thing we can do for someone who maybe, because we often talk about the sufferers, and rightly so, of these conditions, but as you know, sometimes it's the people next to them that also go through a
100%,
lot.
yeah.
And what's the best thing that people who are next to them can do to support and look after themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because it's interesting. And actually, in When Faith Gets Shaken, Diane, my wife, wrote a book called Secondhand Smoke, a chapter called Secondhand Smoke. And the whole idea is secondhand smoke can still kill you. You might not be the one smoking, but if you're standing next to someone smoking, you can still get lung cancer. And I think there's probably a lack of caring for the carer a little bit and thinking that through, thinking that, like, those traumatic experiences. So I think the best thing that we could do is realize what is our responsibility and what's not our responsibility. And we are not called to fix people, and that we're called to love people. We're called to be Jesus people. We're not called to fix them. And so it's bringing them into a place where they feel like they can get that help and they can get that support. But I think it's taken off that sort of rescuer mentality. We are not the savior. Only Jesus can rescue people. It's a classic thing in counselor. As a counselor, you're not the rescuer. You're there to be there, that safe person. And I think that's a really important thing to realize when you're trying to support people.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Um, So, and how do we know when we have a problem? Like, now I'm slightly asking you to be a counsellor now, but
I'm not a good counsellor. I think, you're asking the wrong person.
So, I mean, at what point should we start taking seriously? Because it feels to me like there's a spectrum of these things. Like,
Yeah,
all of us are going to at some point go through down periods or
yeah,
have anxiety over things. Like if you've got a job interview or whatever, that's completely
yeah.
normal. But then there's a point where actually this isn't normal anymore, and we should probably get help. And I sometimes wonder whether part of or some of the problems is they don't get well diagnosed. Maybe we just think, oh, it's just normal until actually it gets drastic,
Yeah,
or not. I don't know.
yeah. I think you're right. I think the other thing to say about anxiety is that anxiety is really helpful at times, isn't it? And we all need anxiety, otherwise, we'd be very dangerous people. And so I think that's really important. And the other thing I'd say about anxiety is that I've known that a lot of people that struggle with anxiety, anxiety isn't weakness. I think that's the key thing for me. That people that struggle with anxiety are often sensitive, loving, caring, considerate. In fact, they're more loving and considerate than a lot of other. They're just so sensitive, and we need them actually. But it's like the flip side of the coin. It's almost like the car alarm or the smoke alarm. Smoke alarms are very helpful if they're going off all the time. It's annoying. It's annoying for you, and it's annoying for everyone else. um, and I guess that's the key to the answer to your question is like if the smoke alarm's going off all the time, if it's affecting your daily life, then actually that's probably a time to make sure you get some help.
Yeah.
Whereas and there's a big difference between worry and anxiety. I think the two often get chucked together. Worry can be quite useful. I worry a little bit about being on time. The result of that is I'm on time. Anxiety is almost like those something I feel in my body. It's not particularly helpful at times. It can be a lot more controlling. And so yeah, so it's important to really look into this stuff.
Okay, so one more question before we move on to our quickfire round.
Yeah,
I think it's Oswald Chambers said something along the lines of self-pity is of the devil, and if I wallow in it, I can be of no use to God, or something like
yeah.
that. So I think about it from time to time, and how do we balance kind of self-care and compassion with self-pity and
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, like, self-care or self-compassion and self-pity are two very, very different things. And I often, when I went to see my counselor, she went, I think you need to be more self-compassionate. And I was like, yeah, no, don't be stupid. One is, I sort of used to think of that as like candles and baths, and I'm a geezer, I don't want that in my life. And she was like, you have so got a bad definition of what self-compassion is. I think self-compassion actually takes a lot of discipline. It means I'm going to watch what I eat. It means I'm going to exercise. It means true self-compassion is talking to yourself the way that you would talk to your best friend. We are our own biggest critics. I wouldn't dare talk to you the way I would talk to myself. I wouldn't dare go away from this interview going, oh, all the things I did, I just wouldn't do it. And I think that's the big difference. And I think sometimes that we need to realize the difference. I think self-compassion and self-esteem are different. Self-compassion and self-pity are different. I think self-pity puts you in a very, very negative place, and it's almost like victim mentality where, like, everyone's against you. That is so different. It is a million miles away, in fact, because there's no discipline in that at all. So yeah, very, very two very, very different concepts.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to our quickfire questions now then. So what one thing do you know now that you wish you'd known as a 20-year-old?
Probably that self-compassion and self-indulgence are two very different things. I used to think that was just selfish, and so I showed myself no self-compassion whatsoever, just worked myself into the ground.
Yeah. How do you keep going through discouragement / dark night of the soul?
Day at a time.
Great answer. What would be your top book recommendation? And you're not allowed to say the Bible.
I would say The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown.
Okay. I know it's quickfire, but would you like to say anything else about that book?
It's just brilliant. It's brilliant. It's looking at wholehearted living. I think perfectionism is one of the biggest issues of our time, actually. And yeah, if you haven't read any of Brené Brown's stuff, I would thoroughly recommend it.
We'll look that up. I think I've only watched something on TED that she did, which was 2 TED Talks, which were very, very good.
Yeah, genius.
The vulnerability one, I think.
Yeah.
If you could send a tweet-sized message to 18 to 30-year-olds, what would it say?
Go gently, be mindful about what you're thinking, and show others and yourself compassion.
Patrick, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you giving of your time. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you. You've got a new book coming out, is that correct?
Yeah, Bouncing Forward. So I'm looking at resilience. One of the really key things I've thought about during this time is resilience by definition is thriving in the midst of adversity. And as I thought, there's no better time to be talking about resilience. And when I studied it, it was fascinating. A lot of people define resilience as bouncing back. You know, it's in the news at the moment. We're talking about the economy bouncing back, this bouncing back. New research says resilience is less about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward. We've been changed by what's happened. Life changes us. And so it's taking the good and the bad and learning, how do I thrive in the midst of adversity? How do I bounce forward through this? So yeah, it's grappling with all those things, which has been fascinating to write. But I'm very glad I'm nearly at the end of it.
That sounds good. Well, when can we get hold of that?
It's probably February 2021.
February. Oh, so you can't go on the Christmas list, but we'll
no, nearly.
We'll look forward to reading that as our Easter present or whatever. Well, thanks, Patrick, and take care and God bless.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for your time. We enjoyed the conversation. Apologies again for breaking your shed door. Listeners, friends, don't worry about it. Another conversation for another day. But we would love to hear from you. We've now kind of drawn to a close. This is the last episode in this series. So we'd love to know what you thought about this episode. We'd love to know what you thought about the series as a whole. Please do get in touch with us. Drop us a DM on Instagram at make_you_known, or just right here in the comments section or wherever. So that's it for now. Until next week, when Valley and I, who've made the series, will just be sitting down to have a little conversation about the kind of whys and wherefores of this whole endeavour. And hopefully that will be a little bit enlightening if you're interested. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.